Doing today, my name is Jaheim Mullen, and I will be talking about federal housing assistance. So I'll first be discussing exploring federal housing assistance policy. In the U.S., social welfare programs that try to give low-income families and homes access to affordable housing must include federal housing assistance policies. It addresses problems like homelessness, affordable housing, and community development. Through a number of programs ran by the government agencies such as Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD abbreviated, since the 1930s, a number of government efforts have been put in place to provide solutions for cheap housing. One law aimed to address homelessness is the Homeless Emergency Assistance and Rapid Transitions to Housing, HERTH, Act in 2009. The desire was for homelessness and unstable housing to continue to be major problems. As it was a major problem, it was a need to fix these problems. Studying the evolution of federal housing policies across time, identify patterns in homelessness and unstable housing, and assessing the success for public programs. Using frameworks such as the theory of change and logic model, I will try to provide theoretical explanations on how to improve housing problems and homelessness. The research evaluates the discrepancy between housing needs and available aid by including empirical data from many sources, as it highlights patterns including the rise of renter household dealings with affordability concerns and shifts in the composition of households receiving HUD assistance. The findings show issues with federal housing policies, such as growing disparity between housing demands and available funding, beneficiary demographic changes and dependency of subsidies such as low-income housing tax credits. Long studies, comparative evaluations of policy responses, and investigations of novel strategies for affordable housing are among the most recommended for this research. I will dive into the historical development of federal housing assistance. From the 1930s to 1960s, with the initiatives like United States Housing Authority, USHA, and the Public Works Administrations of New Deal, the federal government first became involved with housing assistance. The construction of affordable homes for low-income households was the main goal of these programs. A major advancement in the government housing system was made possibly by the Housing Act of 1937, which established the public housing programs. The goal of this public housing development was to give low-income individuals and families access to safe homes and clean environments. From the 1970s to the 1990s, the transition to rental assistance during this time was Section 8 vouchers. This became very important for federal housing assistance programs. For conventional public housing, Section 8 gave qualified household rental assistance so they can select homes on private markets. Since the inception in 1986, the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program has encouraged private developers to construct affordable rental properties for renters with low incomes. And then this translated from the 2000s to the present. Hybrid financing options, which include parts of tax incentives, rental assistance, and construction-based aid, began to grow in the early 2000s. These tactics were to solve housing affordability issues while maximizing private investments. Aiming to increase coordination among service providers and streamline homeless aid programs, reforms to policies like the Homeless Emergency Aid and Rapid Transition to Housing Act in 2009 were implemented. Trends in the homelessness and housing insecurities. I will be discussing the patterns they've had and what has been like a common thing that has been withholding federal housing assistance. Rising issues of homelessness and housing insecurities. Homelessness and housing instability have been steadily increasing since the 1930s. Despite changes to federal support programs, renters with low incomes are particularly affected because affordability issues are becoming more and more of a matter nowadays. The amount of affordability problems have increased by 2015. Almost half of renters reported having trouble finding affordable housing. Over time, the divide between the amount of housing that is needed and the aid is available has grown significantly. A sign that the policies in place are not keeping up with the increasing demand of affordable housing. Disparities between housing needs and federal assistance. The gap between housing needs and available has increased despite of the initiatives of trying to do better with low-income housing tax credit programs and homeless emergency help and rapid transition to the Housing Act of 2009. There has been a decrease in the proportion of low-income tenants receiving assistance, suggesting that current programs are not as successful. Reaching these people's needs, the demographics of the HUD-assisted households are changing. They're always fluctuating. With the increasing number of elderly and disabled people, there are fewer families with children. These changes have demonstrated how the population of receiving household or housing aid has changed completely. Solutions for these trends and these patterns that has been happening over the years. Studies that draw comparisons across numerous time periods and geographical areas might provide insights on these patterns and efficiencies of policy development. Programs for housing assistance that include social and health services and better serve every need of homeless population and encourage social integration and long-term stability. It is advised to conduct more research and evaluate the successful housing aid programs, especially in relation to their effects on crime rates and the likelihood of homelessness in the future and health outcomes. The theoretical framework that I used was a theory of change. As a theory, with using and implementing this theory, placing homeless people in housing programs as soon as possible, according to the theory of change, will have the best effect on the community by lowering crime rates, lowering the chance of homelessness in the future, and lowering the demand of emergency services. In order to solve more significant social concerns while improving general well-being and integration into society, this theory emphasizes the significance of stable housing. An understanding of housing projects will be able to attack homelessness and the social issues that can be gained by methodically describing and assessing their inputs and activities, outcomes, and impacts through the use of theory of change. The causal relationship between housing policies and homelessness-related consequences are further explained by the logic model. That is the second theory that I've used. It outlines the means by which housing programs must be funded, the procedures by which people are placed in housing units and receive support services. The result of this is the number of people sheltered, the outcomes such as decreased rates of homelessness and crime, modifications in the circumstances and behavior of certain participants, and effects on larger changes of society, such as financial savings from fewer emergency room visits to improve community well-being. Researchers can say systematically assessing if housing projects are effective in producing desired results, it impacts the logic model, and this impacts how the future of homelessness is. In the field of federal housing aid, a thorough understanding of these pathways and impacts is very important for planning and having a program be perfect and better from the past. Policymakers can identify these areas and distribute resources more wisely and create focused interventions to meet the changes and the needs that these families are needing to make their housing more stable. The method that is used. Using a variety of sources for literature review, including books, government records, and reports from housing advocacy organizations, learning about the issues facing public housing aid and the evolution of federal housing assistance programs over the time, trends in homelessness and housing insecurities, potential solutions and policy implications are all implied for this methodology for this project. Empirical data collection to obtain quantitative data on homelessness statistics, housing trends, and housing assistance programs. Access data set from reputable sources such as the Census Bureau or the HUD. The use of qualitative research methods like surveys and interviews to gain more insight and gain the people's awareness on it. Applications of the logic model and the theory of change. While utilizing the theory of change framework to comprehend the causal relationship between the results of homelessness and the federal housing policies, this all determines the significant actions, inputs, outputs, and outcomes and impacts. Explaining the inputs, process, results, and the effects of housing placement interventions using the logic model. This model helps aid the assessing of how well housing programs are with handling homelessness. Conclusion. The study shows how in order to effectively address homelessness, and housing instability going ahead in the future that places a high priority on social inclusion, long-term stability, and cross-collaborations is required. Even though federal policy has made headway in addressing housing requirements, there are still a lot of obstacles to overcome, a lot of more improvements. These theoretical frameworks, such as empirical data and creative approaches, can be used for policymakers to help improve housing aid gaps and guarantee that everyone has access to secure and affordable housing.